Now, what's going to happen is I am about to introduce all our lovely panelists, but before I do, I want to say a few brief words about how this panel got its origins. So we at the Penn Translation Committee have a long history of concern about the way translated books are reviewed, because all of us translate books like critics who review books. We love books, and we love working with literature and translating them. And all of us have had the experience of translating a book and seeing it reviewed very enthusiastically and not being mentioned at all in the review. And we've spent a lot of energy thinking about how could this be? Why is this? Do the reviewers not care about us? But we think they do care about us. Is there a miscommunication between translators and reviewers? Can we talk? And we decided that we should talk. And so we contacted the National Book Critics Circle and asked if they would like to talk to us about the reviews of translations, reviewing practices. And of course, they met us with open arms and said, we'd love to. And so this panel came about, and it's a true collaboration. Now, the panelists seated before you, directly to my left, this is my left, is Yulia Rabinovich, who comes to us from Germany, but she was, Austria.
No, Austria.
I'm like, what? Sorry, I didn't write it down right. But was born in St. Petersburg and moved to Vienna at the age of 7. She's a playwright with 3 plays and a novelist. Her debut novel, Spaltkopf, isn't that a great sounding title, even if you don't know German? Spaltkopf was published in German in 2008 and translated into English as Splithead by Tess Lewis, who I see in the audience, who's also a Penn Translation Committee member. And was published in 2011 by Portobello Books. Her plays, including Romeo und Julia, which I won't translate, and Stück ohne Juden, a play without Jews, have been staged in renowned theaters in Vienna. Her latest novel, Heart Novella, was published last year in Austria, and she also has Portobello might be bringing out yet another book of hers, so we have to cross all our fingers that this will happen. To her left is Ruth Franklin, who's a literary critic and a contributing editor at the New Republic. She writes regularly for The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, and many other publications. Her first book, 1,000 Darknesses, Lies and Truth in Holocaust Fiction, examines the intersection between memoir and imagination in works by authors such as Elie Wiesel, Primo Levi, W.G. Sebald, and Jonathan Safran Foer. The Atlantic hailed this book as a towering work of criticism and insight, and Tablet magazine named her one of our most important critics under 40. She's currently working on a biography of the American writer Shirley Jackson. And if you notice a sort of a glittering aura about her, it's just because she has just, at one blow, won the Roger Shattuck Prize for Criticism, a Guggenheim, and a year's fellowship at the Cullman Center. So we have greatness in our presence. No less great, sitting to her left, is the wonderful Lorin Stein, who is the editor of the Paris Review and has published reviews in places like the New York Review of Books, Book Forum, and Harper's, so all the best places. He formerly worked as a senior editor at Farrar, Straus and Giroux, where he worked with a lot of very illustrious writers like Jeffrey Eugenides, and also edited translations, so he knows quite a bit about it. He's also done some translations from the French himself, including The Mystery Guest by Grégoire Bouillet, sorry about my pronunciation, and Autoportrait by Édouard Lévé. I don't want to know how my French is. And finally, the gentleman to whom I'm about to turn over this panel to get us started is Eric Banks, who's currently the president of the National Book Critics Circle. He served on its board of directors since 2008. He was formerly a senior editor at Art Forum, and in 2002, he relaunched the sister publication of Art Forum, Book Forum, which is about books, not art, in case you were wondering. He served as editor-in-chief of Book Forum for 6 years and contributes reviews to a range of newspapers and magazines, including, among others, Chronicle of Higher Education, the New York Times Book Review, the Financial Times, and the Los Angeles Times. So we're in very good hands here. Eric, it's all yours.
Thank you. Is this on? I thought I would also say just a few words about the relationship between Penn and the NBCC, because I think it'll give us a way to start to talk about some of the aspects of reviewing books in translation. A little while back when we were starting to have a preliminary discussion with Penn about all different kinds of things concerning reviewing books in translation, we started to discuss a little bit the desirability of creating an award that would be co-administered by the NBCC, by the National Book Critics Circle, and Penn. It's something we're still continuing to discuss. I'm not sure what will ultimately be the outcome of our discussion, but it would be an award that would be somewhat analogous to the Balakian citation, which we currently give each year in recognition of excellence by an NBCC member in reviewing for a given year. And it seems like, on the surface, it's a no-brainer, obviously, to reward great work in reviewing books in translation. It's something that would bring bring greater public attention to terrific reviews of books in translation, and I think might also, help us to say this is a model of what we think is an excellent review of a work in translation. This is what we do when we review a work in translation. This is what the kind of review this is the kind of review we want to recognize and honor. But it does raise a lot of interesting questions, and it's the kinds of things that we started to think about had to do with how different, when we review a work in translation, is it really different in kind from the usual reviewing that we do of any other? We're talking really here about fiction and novels for the most part. We'll leave nonfiction reviewing aside, I think, for the moment, but I'm hoping we'll talk about that. But is it really a different beast from what we do when we review any other book, and particularly any other work of fiction? I'm not certain it is, but I'm very curious to hear what our panelists will have to say about that. We also started to wonder what kinds of submissions we would see if we had this award. Because the way that it works now, the kind of reviews where you see the most extensive and most interesting discussions about translation are on the occasions when classics are being retranslated. It's very different to see the kind of discussion about what a translator does, what a translation is, and how it contributes to a publication when the thing being reviewed is written by Flaubert rather than by Lorin Binet, or it's written by Mon rather than Julya. It sets up a very interesting set of dynamics that I think review editors face, that reviewers face, and that reviewers have to ask themselves when they're thinking about the expectations of their readers. So those are the kinds of things that I think we might want to talk about tonight. One other thing I'd like to say before we start is just that we're going to have this discussion for the next, till I think right around 7 o'clock. And because we do have so many translators and reviewers in the audience, we'd love it to, if we could open up the discussion to the floor and take your questions and just have a kind of wider conversation for, for our panelists. But I thought I'd start just by getting a sense. We have 2 American reviewers, and we have a writer who does not write reviews, but is certainly aware of how her work has been reviewed and of also review practices in Austria and Germany. But I thought I just would start by getting a sense of you guys, how many books do you think you review in translation in relationship to, to books that aren't in translation? And are there languages that you feel competent in reviewing in a different way than other languages? So I'll start with Ruth.
Sure, I'll start. I haven't crunched the numbers. Can everybody hear me? Is my mic on? I haven't crunched my own numbers, but right, there I go. Okay. Roughly estimating, I think I review around a quarter of books in translation. And that is, around a quarter of my reviews are of books in translation, which, of course, as I thought about it, strikes me as a very low proportion indeed. But then perhaps in context, when we think about the percentage of books, of translated books that are actually on the American book market, which is generally acknowledged as around 3%, then my percentage isn't that terrible at all. I feel like it's not about the numbers, of course, but it's about the kinds of reviews that one does and how important these books are and what sort of consideration they're given in the publications we work for. And I feel proud, I'm sure Lorin does too, and Eric and Susan, of being part of publications that do make a point of seeking out books in translation, both new and old, not so much sometimes for the significant value that the translation brings to the new work, and sometimes for the translation itself is just a conveyance of what the work is saying. I'm putting that poorly, but one thing that came out of my thoughts as I was considering the issues that this panel might bring up is that there are essentially two types of reviews of books in translation, as there are two types of books that get translated. There are books that are translated because the ideas, the content, the message, whatever of the book is what's most important. And in that sense, the translation functions as a conveyance of the book. And there are books in which it's the language that's most important. In that case, the translation is an event in and of itself. And I think this is usually the case for poetry, as well as almost always for the case when classics are retranslated again. Then it's about the translation and about the translator rather than about the work itself. And I think the ways in which we approach these two works can be very different, and they lead to two totally distinct types of book reviewing.
I think that's a really interesting way to break that down. And as you said, the New Republic, I think, which is not the only place where you review, but it's you've been for a long time, until recently, senior editor, and reviewing regularly for that publication. I think does have a very strong sense that its readership is interested in literature from all over the world. And I think that also extends into the review practices that, not just by staff members, but also by people who are called in to do reviews, really cover a terrific range of literature and translation in that publication. Lorin, I'm just curious also, when you've been doing the reviews fairly recently for Harper's, I think last year, I had the sense that you were covering a decent number of books in translation. Is that not fair?
That's right. Eric's talking about. I sat in as the fiction roundup guy at Harper's for a couple of months, and it just happened that there were a bunch of French books that seemed interesting, and so I ended up writing. But those were the squibs, not really reviews, just notices. I'd like to go back just for a second to something Ruth said. It's funny. It seems like a very sensible division for a critic to make between books where the translation is conveyance because what's at issue really is the substance, and books where style is what's most at issue. And as a former book editor, I think, change the lens a tiny bit and say that for us, actually a translator once, a Haitian translator made this distinction, and it made a lot of sense to me, that she said that there were three kinds of translation when we're talking about literary translation. There's the first one that should ideally give the book a life in the target language. There's the second one that should bring it back to some sort of more correct, more faithful relation, a sort of revisionist translation. And then eventually, over the life of a very successful book, there might be a scholarly translation. And I like that because it gave book editors and first wave translators a good excuse for cheating. And I think that there's a lot to be said for cheating. I mean, to leap, and maybe I'm taking things out of the proper chronology, but the question of an award for book reviewing, my instinct would be that would probably make the most sense most often when we're talking about classics getting retranslated, partly because if you're trying to establish, whether it's Sebald, a famous stylist, or Roberto Bolaño, a famous stylist, if you're trying to establish these writers for the first time in America, you don't want to waste time necessarily, unless there's a problem with the translations. You don't want to waste time pointing out that the translators are doing a very good job. Ideally, you don't want to hear their names until people come along who start complaining about the quality of the translations that we have.
Do you think it's necessary to point out that they do, when they do, that they do a good job?
I'm always happiest when I get away with it as a translator, when no one mentions the translation. In a certain way, other translators I'm sure feel differently, but translation is the only kind of writing that I know of where the question is just how to limit the damage.
I think the faint rustling sound we're hearing is Translator Hackles rising throughout the entire
I could see
auditorium.
that too.
And speaking for a lot of translators, I'd like to say that we think that if you think that a author who's being discovered in English for the first time writes well, you wouldn't be able to think that if the translator did not write well. We want that fact to be noticed.
Oh, I agree that is a true fact, but I would rather that fact not be noticed. As someone who cares more about establishing the reputations of important writers in America than I care about establishing the reputations of important translators, it seems to me that, and maybe it's not a zero-sum game, but in the first moment, the first month that the book comes out, the first round of reviews, I think it is a zero-sum game to some extent. I'm playing devil's advocate, but it's the same reason that, well, I'll say it.
Well, this does bring up just the interesting question. I mean, what do you expect to see in a review of a book in translation? I mean, what is it that you would like to see in those reviews if the translator is a sort of transparent figure? What would you hope to see in those reviews? Lorin? I mean, anything and everything but that.
It would depend on the book under review, but it would absolutely depend on the book under review, just as it would depend on the book under review if it weren't in translation. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's great when there's a moment sort of 3/4 of the way through the review that you want as a translator or as the editor of a translation, where they say Natasha Wimmer's fluent and absolutely beautiful. That's great, that's wonderful. But the time for an in-depth discussion of a translation, I think, is when Lydia Davis comes out with a new Flaubert, or Richard Howard comes out with a new Maupassant, or Arthur Goldhammer, or when these translators who we've learned over years and decades to follow, they're translators who we've learned to care a lot about. Those, when they choose a new project and it's something that already exists in the language, that's when I would want to see the translation discussed.
Right, but I guess I want to get into that a little bit, because there's that line that we're so familiar with seeing in that classic style of book review, the shorter type of book review where you have 1,500 words and you don't have a lot of time to parse the translator's choice of phrase in such and such a passage versus this other passage, and so you say, oh, this whatever this is translated fluidly and elegantly by so-and-so. And this doesn't actually mean, it means that, okay, yes, you appreciate the translation, but what this line is there is it's a marker to the reader of your review saying, I know what I'm talking about here. I'm actually capable of assessing this translation, which is probably what's in the back of your mind. Because how can I review this translation? I'm reviewing a book, but I'm also reviewing a translation of a book. And how can I review them both at the same time if I don't have some sense of whether the translator fulfilled his or her obligations or not? And I think, in many cases, this line has become cheapened because I think not all reviewers who use it, it's become kind of a shorthand for this translation read well, rather than I personally, as the reviewer, can confirm that I at least did some minimal due diligence, and the translator does indeed appear to read the language that the book is translated from.
Right. Ably translated from the Icelandic.
Exactly.
Sitting next to me, Yulia Rabinovich just said something about having pity with the poor translators. Could I ask you to say that into the microphone?
Yes, of course. I think it's a little bit a tragedy in this, because if the translation was good, then in the reviews they will be told that's a good book. If the translation was not so good, the translator has made a mistake. So it comes along in German reviews, so I can't tell very many things about the English ones, of course. The only review I read, which was concentrated on the translator, not on the works itself, was the new translation of Dostoevsky into German by Svetlana Geyer, which was very appreciated. But this was for many, many years the only mentioning of a translator. in a good way.
In those reviews, yeah. That's interesting because there's it's such a higher percentage of the I assume of the Austrian market. I know it certainly is in the German market. The number of books that are in fiction market and translation. So it's a relatively transparent aspect of reviewing there as well.
For me, it's of course a creative work too. So someone has not to translate a book, but transform it into another world of another language. So there is much responsibility in this process, and I think you need a lot of feeling for the text, not only the knowledge of the language. So it's in a way a writing process again, gespiegelt? A mirrored writing process. And not mentioning this is like hanging a picture on the wall of an unknown artist, even if the name is known.
But your novels translated into English, you did read the reviews in English of the translation, correct?
I did.
Did you have an impression about it? Did you think that there was a sense that the reviewers had done justice to both the book and to the translation?
Once I thought that the slap in the face, which should be into mine, landed into Tess Lewis' face. It was not her fault. It was my way to tell the story, which was, for this reviewer, not very good understandable. Others were quite positive, but didn't mention Tess. So I felt a little bit offended by this, because we worked very intensively together. And I was very lucky because that was a language where I could work with her. If it would be a translation in French. Mm-hmm. So, you see, my English. I wouldn't be able to work with her or control what I have read. If you are reading a text and it's written in another language, but it's still your text, then the work is good. If I read it in public and I don't have the feeling that I read something which has changed, then it's great. And the first accept which I saw was in this quality for me. So I didn't wait for the others to. Das waren so Beispielsarbeiten. Das waren mehrere.
Ich verstehe es auf Deutsch nicht.
Okay.
It was a small, short exemplary text.
Yes, it was.
Sample translation.
Yes.
Sample
And
translations.
I didn't wait for the others to give their text to me, because it was so clearly that this is my translator for me.
Tess. We like to hear that.
It was important for me to say it because it's like it was. It was a very easy choice for me.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, Lorin.
Well, I was just thinking, maybe one way to narrow down, if we were talking about the question of what a prize would look like if it was a prize for translation, maybe one non-controversial thing that we would say at the beginning, I would think, would be that it would not be for very short reviews, the kinds of reviews that most of us write most of the time, 1,500-word reviews. Maybe we could agree that in a 1,500-word review of someone who's relatively new to American readers, there isn't more than some sort of marker, some sort of fluidly and elegantly or ably translated from the Icelandic, which we all know is a placeholder. We know that not a big claim is being made there. The translator is getting patted on the head. And again, when it's me, I'd rather be patted on the head than reviled. And and then maybe when we talk about reviewing translation, we would only then be talking about reviews of 3,000 or 4,000 words.
Well, this brings in also the expectations that review editors would bring to the would bring to the table when you turn in your copy as a reviewer. I mean, what there's I think that's obviously the case where there is an expectation that you would discuss the actual work of translation, and you would talk about the actual translation. it would only be really in longer reviews. It doesn't tend to turn up in 500-word reviews. I was looking at a couple of reviews of a book that we both admired, Peter Stamm's 7 Years, to see how I reviewed it myself, but I was trying to look at how other people sort of dealt with the issue of translation. And I think it was interesting that in fairly short reviews, there was an ambition to bring in a sense of what Michael Hoffman, as a translator, how he translated this text, how it might have looked in German. I have no idea whether the reviewers actually could read German or not, but I certainly got the sense from what they were saying in their reviews that they could, which I thought was admirable. And I thought that there was at least a sense to nod to the kinds of books that we expect to see Michael Hoffman translate, and why he might have an interest in a sort of longer collaboration with Peter Stamm, and what it might say about Stamm's own kind of fiction.
Maybe just to elaborate for a second, for you, Julia, Hoffman is a big enough deal as a translator that when he chooses a relatively unknown Swiss writer to translate, if you're the publisher, that might be the best thing that might be your trump card, and that's a kind of special condition. That's a neat thing about being established. I'm sure that if you went to a publisher, Susan, and said that you wanted to translate something,
I'm going to go test this out. I'd like to bring the conversation to one more place, something that gets discussed a lot in the Penn Translation Committee, and you should know we've even formed a subcommittee specifically devoted to talking about this question. And some of our subcommittee members I see here. Marianne Newman is here. Margaret Carson is here. Minna Proctor might be back there somewhere. But the question is this: let's say that the gentle reviewer is going to talk about the translation. What kind of things are fair game to talk about? And the Translation Committee's perspective on this, I think, is a larger subset of issues than I'm hearing being mentioned here. And when we were talking in the green room before this panel, both Ruth and Lorin talked about all the languages they read, and it sounds to me as if both of you are more likely to want to talk about translations from languages you do read, from the perspective of being able to check whether the translation is correct or accurate. And we translators feel, I'm speaking for all of us now, on the other hand, that it should be possible to review a book that was translated from a language you don't read, just as you might have an opinion about the successfulness of the style of a book written in English that you're reviewing. Sure, you can't then judge, was word X translated with word Y actually a mistranslation? Should word X have been Q instead? A lot of reviews that find errors in translation are just, We'll talk about this one thing. I found an error in the translation, point out a mistranslated word, but in fact, it's the belief of a lot of people who are deeply, involved with translation that that's not the most interesting thing to say about a translation. So I read a review recently that said that the translation was weak in that it had a lot of shifts of tone and stylistic inconsistencies in it. And that I found a very interesting thing to say, because it's telling us about the value of the translation and its success, its artistic success, the success of its strategy as a whole, but saying, it's an excellent translation, but the translator made a mistake here or made a mistake there, I translated a book by Jenny Appenbeck called Visitation in English, and in it I discovered that she had a character combing her hair with a brush or brushing her hair with a comb, I forget. So there was a mistake in the writing, the wrong verb with the wrong object. Not very interesting. I happened to mention to her, and she said, fix that in the translation. But no reviewer would mention this because it's not important. And there are so many other things that are important to talk about. So I want to ask all three of the English language critics sitting here if they really would want to stick with the position that you really should only review books translated from languages you read to be responsible. And if Julia has something to say about that, of course I want to hear that too.
I once So I have my favorite book is Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, and I love this book. So I made it as a gift to all of my friends.
Thomas Reschke's translation, right?
Is it the new one or
No,
the old?
that's the older one.
I didn't like it. That's what I wanted to say.
We'll talk
that
later.
was the problem. The problem with that was I made these gifts, and then I was waiting very also gespannt,
Impatiently.
on the reactions, and they were quite okay. Why did you bought this book to me? And for me, it was very clear. It's a great book. They didn't understand it. They didn't laugh about the really genius jokes in it. And then I took this book and then I read it in German, and then I discovered this big part of the Russian humor and the lightness of this book, which is very important because on the other side it's very heavy and very dark, was completely taken down to another level by the translator. I hope it's not the one you mean.
I won't tell him.
But it was a very old translation.
Oh, this one's 20 years old, so maybe you got the
Okay,
new one.
I'm so sorry. It was not as funny as it was in Russian. You can feel that someone who was German translated that, and not a Russian.
Could it have been just that your friends were German, not Russian?
No, because I read it myself, and I just discovered why they didn't understand me. Maybe if you are Russian and you have been brought up with this book and you have read it first time with 9 years and didn't understand a word, of course, but you are growing up with this book and you are reading it again with 12 and then with 15 and then with 20, so you get used to it, you really know it, and then you read it in this German translation and you don't find it there. Then it's a pity. For me, it's a pity.
Maybe we need to read the Yulia Rabinovich translation.
I would love to do that, but someone else has snapped it. I didn't ask for it, but in time, and now it's being published again in a new translation. So, and I'm really unhappy because of that. That would be great.
Well, I feel like this little anecdote really vindicates my own perspective on this, which is that I generally feel that critics should stick to reviewing books that are translated from languages that they're familiar with. And of course, I haven't completely kept to this rule myself. There are always exceptions, but to do a review of a certain level of depth and complexity, I think that is just not possible if you're not capable of assessing the original work as well as the translated work, which, as was pointed out, this is a different creative creation as it is. So the task really is to review two books at one time. And it's possible, of course. I reviewed, for instance, Abi Yehoshua's A Woman in Jerusalem. Because I was interested in him as a writer, I was interested in the stories that he was telling, and I felt myself writing this review in a very different way, much more cautiously than I normally feel when I approach books to review, because I don't read Hebrew well at all, and of course, coming out as I learned more about this, and I had the opportunity to speak to my editor, who is a Hebrew reader, I find out not only did the book have a totally different title in the Hebrew version, which sets things already in a different perspective, but there are many possible disputes about the ways different things could have been done. I find myself considering this book then basically solely on the level of its story and its ideas, and much less capable of saying anything about its style, which I'm not capable of discriminating whether the style that I'm reading is the style of the original or the style of the translation. And this is a very different way of reviewing books, and I find generally a less satisfying way of doing that.
And when that's done well by someone who is fluent in the language, it really shows so much. The quality of the review is so much deeper and so much greater. I mean, one of the reviews that that I admired so much that of a book in translation the last couple of years was in the New Republic. It was Robert Alter's review of David Grossman's To the End of the Land, which did have one of those passages, like slightly annoying, where it's the wrapping the knuckles over some infelicities in the translation, but there was a real sense about this is someone who knew the book in the original, could tell what sorts of not only what sorts of translation decisions were made, but how that book read in different languages and what we might be able to pull out of it as English readers who may not have access to Hebrew, for example. I walked away from that review having read several other reviews of the book, which also had a different title in Hebrew. It was Woman Escaping the News, I think. And in English, it was very different, To the End of the Land. I had read several admirable reviews. I think Colin Toybeen wrote a very interesting review of it on the cover of the Times Book Review that I had actually, sort of when I first read those reviews, thought, oh, this is a terrific review. I have a very strong sense about what this book is, and I also have a very strong sense about a critic who I admire the way that he's assessing this book. After I read the Robert Alter, I felt like I felt absolute distrust for anything else that I read about the book. It's a really interesting experience when you encounter a critical intelligence that is also completely fluent in the language that's under translation.
Right. It's not to say these two types of reviews can't coexist.
No.
There's Colin Toybeen's approaching the book as a novel, as an important novel in and of itself, separate from the language.
Absolutely.
And then there's the kind of more granular language-based approach. The one thing I would say is that where I never break this rule is I wouldn't review a book of poetry translated from a language that I don't read, because I think poetry is just another universe completely where the text is all about the language. The language is the main event. And to read, this is a separate question and gets into my dark and nihilistic feelings about translating poetry at all, but to read poetry in translation, I feel is generally not adequate.
As a practical question, let's say we all want more literature to be published and read in America. Then we cannot restrict book reviewing to people who know the language of origin, right? So I think it's the job of the publisher to give the reviewers a false sense of confidence, so that they feel that they can write about things that in fact they know nothing about. And I agree with everything Ruth said. I don't think I've ever reviewed a book that was translated from a language that I don't know, which is say any language except French. But I've probably written ably translated from the Icelandic. But I wouldn't want to do it. But I've definitely tried to get other reviewers to do it. And it's interesting if you compare our reviewing establishment, which has been destroyed in the last few years, but in many ways, or weakened, but almost destroyed compared to what it was. But what it retains and what it always had, compared to the reviewing establishment in many European countries, for example, is a great deal of independence from publishers and from tastemakers. You find reviewers all over the country making decisions for themselves. That's the tradition, and some of that's been carried over onto the web. But it comes with a certain amount of diffidence. And a Dutch reviewer has grown up with American movies. And I think when we talk about familiarity with a language of origin, it might make more sense to talk about familiarity with a culture of origin, so that I can imagine a reviewer who would feel comfortable reviewing a novel from Israel because he or she had read a bunch of Israeli novels and had seen a bunch of Israeli movies. So there'd be a degree of comfort, even if the reviewer couldn't speak to the decisions of the translator. One very last thing about Eric's, what Eric said about Alter's review in the New Republic. Alter actually, his complaints, his knuckle rapping, as I remember, had to do with solecisms in the English, and flock not heard, when we would say heard, not the other way around, stuff like that. And I always think that that's fair game, but I agree that the risk, if we want people to review translations, then we're going to get a bunch of jerks telling us that we should have done it differently. And even if we, yes, you want the text, especially if it's a first-time translation, the text has to stand on its own as a text. But when it's a second-time translation or a third-time translation, there are beauties in accuracy. I mean, the Lydia Davis Proust, for example, is a more beautiful book because, and maybe this gets into a realm that we don't want to go, but there's a certain kind of translation that I love that hints at the failures of any translation, that hints at the language that's not there. And by reading it, whether or not you know the original language, you can feel that. I'm reading a Japanese novel right now. I don't know a word of Japanese, and it's a sentimental novel. It's a book I'm surprised to find myself loving, and I'm loving it. And part of what I'm loving is that the translation is hinting at these late-night drunken conversations in sake bars that the translator lets me know that they're talking in ways that I will never talk, but doing it in language that's idiomatic enough that it's not keeping me from reading.
Yeah, I feel very irresponsible because I here at Penworld Voices, maybe 2 years ago, heard a Finnish writer named Sophie Oksanen read, and I loved her book, and I wound up reviewing it for German radio, and I forgot to take into account the fact that I know no Finnish. I even talked about the translation. Now I feel really terrible. No, but in all seriousness, Lorin, the fact that you raised this example about the flock versus herd, that I think is perfect for what I want to talk about, because that's a kind of nitpicking that's not the, oh, you mistranslated that word. That's the kind of nitpicking that's about, oh, you're not writing English well enough. And I really want translations to be talked about in terms of how they are as pieces of writing. And that's exactly the kind of comment that points to that. It's being judged as a work of English, and he fell down while writing English. Okay, that's worth talking about. I mean, he's great, so he slipped. It happens. But
yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, it can be very peanut gallery, that kind of action. But I thought what was so interesting in that review was that it there was a way that he continued to return to like what sort of root senses of translations, what the Hebrew might have, where it might have taken us in a different direction. I mean, I think that's one of the great things about the kinds of reviews we're talking about. I did Lydia Davis, for example. I mean, there were so many really interesting reviews that came out of that. They really gave you a sense that you talk about the imperfections of or the perfections of the translation. They give you a much stronger sense of the imperfections of all the translations and how they must be, that wall of language has to be accounted for in some kind of way by a critic.
I just wanted to add to what you have told about the book in Japanese, which you didn't read, of course. A translator has to be not only a writer and not only a translator, but he has to become a changeling between the language which he is working from into the next one. So he has to be the writer of this book also and the translator in one piece. So of course it stands and falls at a big part with the translator. So he has to become the author on one way and has to stay himself. So it's quite difficult, I think. So that's why I didn't do it with Master and Margarete.
But it pays so well. But it pays so well.
Ow.
So are we then simply limited when we're looking at translation from languages that can't count a lot of critics as fluent speakers of Basque or Icelandic,
Hungarian,
or Hungarian, or Finnish, or any of the Finno-Ugaritic. I know, what are we going to do? They have such a great case structure.
I mean, the Hungarians have produced more great novels in a country the size of Bulgaria than all of the Soviet Union since World War II. I say that this is a stupid thing to say, but it's a sense that I have. But we don't have very many people who can review these Hungarian novels, and very few who can translate them. So so I would worry about differentiating too much between the reviewing of translations. I mean, all of us wanting the same thing. I think I'm not sure if it's practical to, because it makes people more self-conscious. I would worry about what they're doing when they're reviewing a translation.
I'm now picturing, like, every time a book translated from French comes out, all the reviewers, wrestling who gets it, because everyone knows French and everyone wants it.
How awful.
There's only one way out of this, and that is for us to learn Hungarian.
That's right.
I think that's a great idea.
It makes me wonder if there's really been a cultural shift in our moment towards the kind of fidelity in translation and fidelity in reviewing translations that I was talking about, because, as we look back into literary history, it was common for novels from the Hungarian to be translated by people who were translating them from French. And that there used to be this whole market, or some sort of market, for these secondhand translations. I've seen novels from Polish that were translated into English via French. for
Yeah, the
instance,
entire-
or via German.
No, German is better. If you're going to do it,
most
then
of the
German.
novels in that writers from the other Europe series
Right.
were translated from French.
Right.
Canary was
As if
translated
this
from
were
French.
no big deal.
Gombrowicz was probably translated from French.
Gombrowicz can't be translated from any language.
Exactly.
including Polish.
So it really the fact that phenomenon used to exist and now has completely vanished, as far as I can tell, makes me wonder if we lose something in insisting upon the match between the target language and the reviewer. On the other hand, it's horrifying to think of the kinds of translations that must have existed then.
Yeah, that's true.
Look no further than the translation of Ferdiluca that was current until a few years ago. But, yeah.
Standards keep rising, which is a good thing. I think the sort of attention that's paid to the quality of translations now, and the conversation about that compared to the conversations there were about it 70 or 80 years ago, it's a whole different ballgame, and that's a very good thing. You have much more chance to see translated literature that's really going to give you a stronger sense of what the style was like in the original, just because we're becoming ever more conscious of what that looks like when you're translating in English. So we're trying harder in specific ways that I don't think people were as concerned about earlier.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's such an interesting set of questions. I mean, we might want to see if we've got anyone from the audience who wants to talk about anything or
yes.
raise issues with. Yes.
Do you want?
Why don't I'm not sure how the best way to do this with the mic is, but okay.
I'm not sure this is going to make anything simple. I hope it will complicate it to a certain extent, but I think perhaps we also don't want to concentrate only on the translator. I think the book has a history in which translation is one of its stages. And one of the things that we were talking about in the translation subcommittee was the possibility of the translators offering information about that history of the book, finding a way for us to inform reviewers about the things about the book that only the translator knows. Mm-hmm. And in some way giving some kind of a flavor of what that experience is. And that means enriching the reviewer's experience, we hope.
Well, there used to be, it's the absence of the translator's note at the end of the book is something that, I don't know how common a practice it was. It certainly seems to have fallen out of favor. I wonder if...
But, I think this is, again, just from a strictly practical point of view, makes excellent sense. And the way, when I was an editor at FSG, when we were publishing a big fat novel by Bolaño, who had a bunch of smaller books in print from New Directions, we paid a few $1,000s to the translator to write not so much about her process, but about him, a biographical essay. Mm-hmm. And we put a terrible mistake in that essay. Purely by mistake, we said that Bolaño had been a junkie, which wasn't true. And but this was a good trace element because we could see that every reviewer cribbed from our without attribution, I should say, from this thing that we'd stuck in the galleys. We didn't put it in the finished book. The idea was just that it would make reviewers, it would give them a tool for approaching a difficult writer. And I think publishers should, at least I found, and then with another book of his, I always found that it, with really not just books in translation, but any book that the publisher feels is difficult. There used to be a stigma that if you were a fancy publisher, you were supposed to stay out of the business of criticism. But we don't have enough newspapers anymore to let them, because you can't pick up the phone and just yammer at a dozen different newspaper critics and tell them what to look out for, you know.
If publishers do that, make a crib sheet about the book, maybe written by the translator, would Eric and Ruth, is that something you would welcome for your reviewing practice?
Sure. I mean,
Yeah.
I would read it.
And frankly, it's the kind of research that you have to put into any project to begin with. I mean, that's what it seems like it would absolutely make sense. It'd be something. It's the more information, the better. And I think particularly from the angle of the translator, I think would be extremely welcome. I think a lot of us when we're trying to think about reviewing books in translation, we're so eager to find interviews with translators online, and I think, me personally, I mean, even if I'm not reviewing a book, I'm trying to find out that information. I remember I just devouring those interviews with John Wood a couple of years ago, when looking at some Arne Schmidt translations and that project, and learning in the process so much about his own thinking about retranslating Mann, which was such a fascinating project. And I think that's extremely worthwhile, maybe even more so than the kind of essay that Lorin's talking about. So you publishers in the audience, start commissioning those essays.
Take the one in the back. Who's got the mics? Could you bring it to this lady? And then.
Hi. Who makes the decision to translate a work, and what is it based on? I recently heard a writer who writes in French, lives here, describe himself as untranslatable, but I didn't think that it was up to the writer to make that decision if his works had appeal.
I guess I'll take that question. Usually that's something that's worked out between the publisher of the original, so the French publisher in this case, if it was published in France, and the American publisher. It happens occasionally that a translator will discover an author, love the author, run screaming to a publisher and saying, look at this wonderful author I found, and usually that does not result in a publication. It occasionally does. The better known the translator is, the more likely it is. But I spent many years trying to do that before realizing that it was fruitless and giving it up. So usually the transaction happens via the American publisher. Take this question.
I would like to hear more about this idea of cultural fluency. I'm a reviewer, and I also actually want to be a translator from Icelandic, ironically.
You have an able look about you.
All the publishers, she's sitting right there.
The idea that you'd only review from a language that you speak when you're talking about a language like Icelandic, I mean, that's kind of terrifying. There's so many books that need that coverage. You're talking about introducing these books and these authors to a wider audience. And I think that it's very important that the people who are reviewing have a knowledge of the culture of the literature that's available in translation already. I'm very comfortable reviewing Nordic books, but I wouldn't try to talk about a Chinese book, not because I don't speak Chinese, but because I don't know anything about the literature in China right now. And I think that when you're talking about a translation standing on its own as a work of English, I think that can be apparent on a cultural level, on a way that ideas are expressed in a body of language traditionally. And I guess I think that's a wonderful point, this cultural fluency over a linguistic fluency.
Unfortunately, this seems to be kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy because we need more books translated from the Icelandic in order to be able to appreciate the book that you might translate from the Icelandic. It's not as if we are already, there are already not that many options for gaining cultural fluency in, in more obscure languages.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a certain amount of imagination we have as readers, too. I mean, in some ways, the book from Iceland might have more to do with, a New Yorker's everyday experience than, say, a book set in rural Mississippi or, or other countries that speak English that are different from ours, too. So, yes, you should learn something about that milieu, but I don't think the bar has to be set, to the level of writing a PhD thesis, about that. I don't think it has to be that high in order to say something useful about the book. Maybe I'm too glib about this. Next question over here. Who has the mics? And then over there is the runner-up.
Thank you all very much. Just a quick comment. If we didn't translate poetry, we wouldn't have a Bible. So that's in favor of translating poetry and many other famous books. But I was a little bit distressed because, I want to thank everybody. It's been a really good panel. But I was thinking about how if only reviews of classics in translation mention translation, what I'm concerned about is then nobody will understand what they're talking about. I mean, to me, this panel is about, do we talk about translation or do we ignore it? Is it visible or is it invisible? And I think that the biggest argument that I can see for more reviewers mentioning choices that translators make is that way people will learn more about what translation is because, as has been pointed out, we do know more and more because people are writing more and more about it. But I think that's a good direction to go in. And I do think that, I'm surprised, Susan, you didn't point out, but there has been, at least on Words Without Borders and maybe also on the PEN website, a couple of very good descriptions of how to review books in translation without knowing the original language.
Oh yeah, I wrote one of those.
Mm-hmm. and you very pointedly in what you wrote, which was kind of a set of guidelines, I think, more or less, would be the best way to describe it, that you wrote with Edith Grossman.
With Edith Grossman and Jonathan Cohen,
right.
Which I have here. I could read it, but...
And the word fluency is noticeably absent from those set of what a translator might expect from a reviewer. Although I think that the one thing that is there is that you show your work. You don't make claims as a reviewer about aspects of the translation without backing it up in some way or another. You don't say ably translated from the Icelandic unless you quote a little Icelandic and say how the language works and what kinds of options exist for, for.
See, I'm sensing this. I'm
sorry, I'm not trying to make this into like a, this sort of like let's find the wrong word search.
Yeah.
I know that's how that's coming across, but nonetheless, I mean, but that's the same thing that any reviewer does with a book, is that you show your work. That's the sign of a good review.
Are you afraid of venturing onto thin ice as a reviewer and then getting caught out like bad reviewer? That's interesting.
Well, anyway,
because are there the review police who police reviewers?
Oh yeah. But anyway, I mean, I did think that was interesting. And I don't know. I mean, I think I was surprised a little bit when I was talking to you initially about what kinds of expectations you had for reviewers. Yeah. That fluency really wasn't one of the main concerns. Well, that wasn't the the qualifying thing that a reviewer could bring to any review.
I mean, I think that we as translators think that the word fluency isn't differentiated enough. I mean, let me read the one relevant sentence from this guidelines about reviewing that's published on the Words Without Borders website. If the translation stands out because of its elegance, panache, or daring word choices, by all means say so. If it drags and stumbles, this too is worthy of note, particularly if your conclusions are backed up by examples. But that backed up by examples means illustrations. It doesn't have to mean, the original Greek says
that. I realize that.
Yeah. But saying, the translation, the style feels constipated. Look at this, look at that. Mm-hmm. I mean, that would be a critique of of a style, for example.
Yeah.
But then doesn't that always just raise the lingering question of whether this is a problem in the translation or a problem in the original?
Yeah.
But you know, I want to come back to what you said because it's interesting to me. It seems to me that you're asking an awful lot of book reviews. I mean, to me, if a book review, if the thing we mainly want is to bring stuff into translation and then sell it, and get some intelligent talk to happen about it, then probably book reviews are not the best place to talk about the. I mean, and it's an art that I take seriously. Not when I do it, but I mean I take it seriously when great translators do their work. But I would take their names off the covers of the books. I would bury the fact that a book was translated as long as I could, if it meant a better chance of selling 10,000 more copies or 50,000 more copies. You know, put that off till later. I think let translators make their reputations among the experts who know, which is to say editors and fellow translators. And eventually, when the long criticism happens, the translator's work will be appreciated. But I don't think it should happen at the beginning. Not in this world, not in this less than ideal world.
The next question was right over there.
First of all, I just wanted to ask, we have translators in the audience. Can raise your hands, please? I want to thank you guys, first and foremost, for translating foreign literature, because without it, I wouldn't have my favorite author, and I'm going to butcher his last name, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, Jose Saramago. My favorite author, okay? I wouldn't have been exposed to him. I don't read any other language than English. And I love this guy, okay? So thank you very much. Round of applause for our translators, I think.
I love it.
Okay? Second thing, I think we have to have faith in the people that are reading this, whether we're reviewers or just passionate readers, that we can tell if somebody's been translated multiple times or through different translators, whether the translation is being honest or true to their style or form. And I know Jose Saramago has a different way of run-on sentences, very long paragraphs, and some people will call that gimmicky. And that upsets me because I think his translator, he's had the same translator up until the guy died, I think in 2008 or 2009. He's been true to his form in every book that I've read, every book. And I review him because I want more people to read him, and I want people, as far as translators and publishers, to say there's a need to translate the rest of his books because he's got a ton out there that I'm waiting for. So I want to thank you guys for doing that, and also having the faith in us as reviewers to be able to tell the difference. I might not know the language, but I can tell.
Literature translated, you know, as a teacher from languages I don't know, and anyone who's done this has probably been in the position of going to libraries and bookstores and looking at different multiple translations of a book and deciding which one to teach. And I think that requires a certain amount of judgment that doesn't have to do with checking the accuracy of the translations, but you guess, okay, which one sounds most to me the way I imagine this author's voice ought to be. And I do think, you know, what you're talking about is like that same sort of judgment, which may be irresponsible in a sense, but I don't think it's that unreasonable. And perverse thought experiment. What would happen if there would to be, say, a 1-year moratorium on reviewing books translated from languages you know, and all reviewers were asked to review books translated only from languages they don't know? I wonder what that would do for reviewing culture. It would change the expectations of what you were doing. It would lower the threshold for your responsibility in a sense. Would it be a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know, but it might be an interesting idea. Anyway, the next question was Margaret over here.
Yeah, for Lorin Stein, you said that a book would sell more copies if it were not known that it was a translation. It said, I think, 10,000 copies or so. Is that really true, and how do you know?
It's absolutely untestable. Absolutely untestable.
See, that's perpetuating. I'm a translator, and it's perpetuating a myth. I think that many publishers have this idea that it's going to be a money loser if it's known that it's a translation.
Well, I've seen a lot of translations lose money, and I've seen a lot of translations make money, and you can never run the counterfactual, obviously. But the kind of thinking that goes into how to make a book, it would be a hard argument for me to win, but I have to say, the same way, when you're thinking about the way the jacket looks and what's going to go on what copy is going to go on it, the last thing that I would want to do is add another layer of another screen in that moment of marketing. I want the person to think that they're buying a book by the author. And again, I don't have a very good answer for you.
Why is it so bad that it's known that it's a translation? I guess it's...
Maybe that could be marketed specifically. Hooray, this is a especially special book. It's not only written, but it was written and translated.
Well,
It could be a selling point, yeah.
Ideally, you talk out of both sides of your mouth, if you're the publisher. And you send the dog whistle to the people who want to read your translation, my translation, a translation. But then you also want to reach a bunch of people who might not want to think about the apparatus. Not that they don't think that they're going to pick up a foreign book. They know it's foreign. But they may not want an apparatus there. The same way I think it makes sense often not to put an introduction in the book that you're selling, not to put a note in the front. Now, again, I can't test it, but I can. But it's a vibe, and I've done it a lot. I spent 12 years doing it, and I have a sense of what turns on the booksellers and what turns on the people, and it may be wrong. But until there's strong evidence that it's not wrong, I would keep, if I were still in that business, I would keep, or if I translated a book and wanted it to sell, and I would ask that my name not be put on the cover, which is what I do.
Which is precisely the same thing that I think you're advocating and saying that, when a book is being introduced, you don't want to read about the translation in a review. That's not what you want to see a reviewer address. Yeah.
Is it the fear of losing the charisma of the author through the translation?
Yeah, lack of charisma, yeah.
Oh.
It sounds a bit offending.
The next question was over there.
I guess just a small question, or maybe just a comment about this realm of the shorter review, where you're not really discussing the translations because there's only one translation. You're introducing the book. You are talking about language, I think, in any book of literary writing, because there's the form and there's the style and there's the language, and that is the content. At least that's how I feel as a reader. And so I feel like you're writing about the language, and the language is the translators. And so I feel like there has to be a way to do that without necessarily, addressing issues of fluency, but still giving the translator some kind of credit as the writer.
Well, I'll say something. I've just been teaching a seminar at Queen's College, part of CUNY, in which my students reviewed translations, and you can find some of their reviews actually on the 3% website right now, and the exercise was specifically, these are not very long reviews, but the exercise was specifically to figure out a way to acknowledge the translatedness of the book without making that so foregrounded that it distracted from the idea that the review is about the book as a whole, because the book is, a review should never be primarily about the translation. It's one aspect of many or several to be discussed in the book. And I think there's an art to incorporating acknowledgments of the translatedness of the book without overwhelming the reader of the review with that information. So check out my students' reviews on 3%. I'm proud of them. Yes. Katie Assef translated Toussaint's book, whose title I'm now going to blank on. Anyway,
The Truth About Marie.
The Truth About Marie, exactly.
But what clever way did your students find to
Well, in the parts where they were discussing the style of the book and the language in which the book was written, they mentioned the translation along with the stylistic features of the book. So it was incorporated into that part of the discussion. Sure, we'll take that one and then in front.
Thank you. Well, it's easy to recognize good or bad translation, and when I read such a book, I make sure I go to the front and check who the translator is. And next time I'm reading the same author or the book from the same language, I'm trying to find or avoid certain translator. So that's why I think translators should be mentioned in reviews so the good guys get more work.
I think there isn't a question of whether they should be. It should always be noted who translated a book, of course, which is I think what you're talking about. I do the same thing. Yeah.
No, but you were saying they shouldn't be. Their name shouldn't be published on the book.
Oh, the question isn't whether they should be published on the title page, but whether when the book is the jacket, it's essentially the advertisement for the book. Whether that's
my bad.
Maybe there would be a way for translators to get as much charisma. Go for it.
But I guess it's not even the sense that the translator doesn't have as much charisma as the authors, that it's the fear of the book by committee somehow. That what Lorin is saying sounds like to me like the book needs to be presented before its audience as an authentic, unmediated object, one entity, one whole entity, rather than sort of a Cuisinarted pastiche that's been stuck back together then by a pair of people who...
Yeah, that's exactly. I think the two things go together, exactly. You don't want it to look like committee work, and you want it to seem... And of course, we all know that to some degree it is committee work.
If people only knew what editors did,
I mean, you never
no one would buy a book ever again.
You would never list the name of the editor on the cover of the book. I mean, it's just...
In some countries they do. It's odd. It looks so strange to me.
How common is it that authors and translators collaborate? I think you mentioned that you work closely with one, and is this common? Is it expected? Is it behind the scene? Is it open? How does it work?
I think most of my colleagues with whom I have talked about would have wished to have this opportunity to work closely with the translator. You can minimize mistakes or misunderstandings between writer and translator, of course, if you talk with each other. It's a pity that's not possible every time. In some cases, the text was given to an unknown translator, and the author did never get in touch with him or her, which led to misunderstandings or unhappiness in some cases. In the most cases, it was okay, but if someone would ask me what would be better for myself as an artist, of course, it's better to work with someone when you have the feeling that this person understands your work. And if you can help this person to understand your work, it's very, very important for the process of the translation.
The great example of this is Günter Grass, who, whenever he brings out a new book, convenes his international translators for a long weekend or maybe a week where they sit down and go through page after page, and the translators get to ask him about everything they found difficult on every page because he cares that much about the translators really understanding what he meant. And there's a famous story that circulates around the European Übersetzerkollegium, the Translators Collegium. Wow, I can't translate. Anyway, there's a place in Germany where translators come to gather, and he had a meeting there for one of his books, and the translators couldn't understand his description of how somebody got on a bicycle, and he's like, no, this is how it happens. I see it clearly in my mind's eye. And they brought a bicycle into the library and asked him to get on the bike, and he tried a few times and fell down every time, and then said, fix it however you want. I love authors who will talk to me while I'm translating their books. I love that collaboration. I think it's very fruitful. And with a lot of writers that I work with who have experimental styles and play, like Yoko Tawada, I translated a story by her that ended with a sort of alphabet soup where she had words from the story turning into acronyms and spelling out things. And I wound up having to, make my own alphabet based on English spellings. And it was very useful to be able to say, okay, I'm rewriting your text, and the thing that was a monster is now going to be a volcano. What do you think? True story. Are there other questions? There are. This one in the back, and then the gentleman in the front.
Hi, just a question on going back to the mentioning of the translator in the review. It sounds like there's kind of this choosing who to sort of, I guess, market it to. Like there's the experts, the translators who want to know the process, who want to know what, the whole, the schematics of making the translation. And then there's the audience that just wants the work they just want to read the work. And I understand that it's safer to market it to that audience, but is there sort of a midway where there's a reader who doesn't necessarily want to read it because they might think it's an excellent translation, but because they want some sort of indulgence into the culture from which that work is coming? So like, for example, like why people read Chekhov, like in his stories. Mm-hmm. Is there a notion among reviewers that mentioning even slightly that a translator does something particularly well overall, or just something that's very minute and small, that gives some sort of comfort to a reader knowing that they're wandering into the original author's territory in good hands? Like, would that be...
I think that's the most noble purpose of the fluidly and elegantly translated tag. It just says, don't worry your pretty little head. You're getting something very much like the original. Sometimes it's not true.
It seems to me like that the discussion has been all about connection between the translator and the reviewer, in a way, as having as a purpose the conveying the public in a critical manner what the content of a given piece of literature is all about. So let's say, like you were saying, the getting together of the author and the translator, perhaps it has to be pushed or organized or coordinated by the publisher. But that's not the case with translators and reviewers. Reviewers, though they work on, per se, they look at the piece of literature they have and go ahead and give their most honest, profound, clever opinion or learned opinion, what have you. Wouldn't it be possible to have, as a matter of fact almost, not obligatory, but as a matter of fact, that whenever there's a literature translated literature that will be reviewed, that it would be as a matter of fact, perhaps through some sort of association or union that could bring together with the, not to work together in the review, the translators and the reviewer, but to give the reviewer a chance for the translator to give them some insight as to how they understood the original work, not to become accredited with the work of the reviewer, but just to give them a deeper insight in the work's original atmosphere or style or structure.
I think that's exactly the suggestion that Marianne had before, that Lorin said that Farrar Straus used to make as a habitual practice, having the translator draw up an information sheet about the book having to do with these things. And I think it's a splendid idea. I'm going to start doing it immediately. We have time for only one more very short question before we end. Does anyone want it? It's over here. You are obliged to briefness, sir.
Briefness. All right, in 30 seconds. I was just talking to the editor of Robert Fagel's translations of retranslations of the Aeneid and the Odyssey and the Iliad this afternoon, and she talked about this long-term relationship that she had with him and how he would call her 5 or 10 times a day and talk about various passages that he was working on. I wonder about with contemporary authors, as a translator, is there more of an effort to document that kind of collaboration that you have with the author, especially online now? I know Howard Goldblatt is doing that with Nguyen. There's a new project for him to actually document what he's been doing as he's been translating this new novel. So, do you sense that's available to reviewers in a more prominent way now?
You're saying I should be saving my emails and sending them to the reviewers? Maybe.
No, but if beyond what's available in print, typically as an afterword, is there more work of translation that's being foregrounded in terms of how the process works that could be made available to reviewers?
No, but that's an interesting idea, and I think that might be an interesting thing to add to an information sheet to go into the galley, something about how the work was done, and if it was done in collaboration with the author. I think that would be a very interesting thing to write about, in fact. And maybe the reviewers would be happy to see it. Maybe it's not what they would want to write about, but I think it couldn't hurt for it to be there for an option for a reviewer to think about. We have to wrap up. Any last words, Eric?
I think so. No, thank you, everyone on the panel. I think we've
Thank you all.
certainly covered it.
There's books for sale in the far corner by charismatic writers and translators.